Welcome to the OTA podcast where we discuss everything performance training. I'm Coach Chris Barnard. Let's get into it. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the OTA podcast. I was having a discussion the other day inside our coaching group, our OTA coaching group, and some of the questions pertained around the recent video that I put out for our general prep phase or prep phase training for our MLB athletes. I've gotten some questions about this in the past, and I figured I'd just make a podcast and be able to essentially spit on it and my take on it and what you should be doing in the first couple weeks when you start your off-season training. First and foremost, what you have to understand is the way that I view prep phase training or general preparation training is just that, right? It's a prerequisite in order for us to deliver better quality reps once you get into the real heat of your training, right? We're a big fan of block periodization. So before we get into those phases and really start to stress the body, I first want to stress the body in a couple different manners. And that's going to be through increasing an athlete's work capacity, but also being able to challenge the athlete's range of motion. Now, the reason why is because I'm going to overall enhance their mobility, flexibility in the beginning of the off season, but also what I'm able to do is be able to strengthen through that range of motion. And then on top of that, do that with a little bit more volume. And what that allows us to do is once we get into the lower repetitions, the athlete aren't as fatigued, which produces better quality repetitions. Now, what's that look like going through multiple modalities? When it comes to the speed phase, really what I'm doing is just very basic runs. I'm going to start off with some lower limb prep, right? Being able to get the foot and ankle prepared to be able to make those ground contacts. I'm going to start obviously working with some low-level plyometrics that are a little bit more in a linear speed fashion. And then really it's just going to be some basic starts, some basic max velocity sprints. As I progress in the prep phase, what that's going to turn into is a little bit more of neural activation. So these are going to be your very meat and potato, very basic sprint drills like your high knees or your piston runs or your butt kick runs where now we're activating the hamstring, or your high knee butt kick runs or your step over runs, right? Where really what we're trying and focused on doing is being able to fire up those muscles and the nervous system that turns on those muscles as much as we possibly can. So extremely basic drills performed with a high effort with a lot of intent and focus, right? I think that coaches can benefit best from getting their athletes to perform the basics at the highest level, right? Because the results are in the details of how you coach it. So it's not about being able to layer on the next fanciest exercise. It's about doing the fundamentals right and doing them consistently. And how much can you get those athletes locked in? How detailed can you make something so simple and elicit the best stimulus? That's what's really going to get your athletes results. Moving on, when it comes to power, or actually stay in the speed range. So when it comes to agility and our overall ability to change directions, what that's going to look like is a lot of, lateral pogos. So start the same way with the lower limb. We're going to perform some lateral shuffles at a high level and perform them at a wide base so I can really challenge that range of motion. I'm perform some lateral power shuffles where we're working a little bit more from a plyo stance. We can go some crossover bounds, some very basic fundamentals that we're going to perform. Karaoke and multiple variations of karaoke run, step over runs or crossover runs, I should say. These are very basic fundamental lateral movement patterns. And then what we can do is we can start diverting forces where they do some very basic lateral shuffles, some very basic 45, 90-degree turns, some very basic reverse or back pedal to acceleration or acceleration to back pedal. And in addition to that, I love to start to introduce a little bit more aggressive deceleration, but I really do that in the isometric and eccentric phase. Next, moving on to power, is going to be our very low level jump. So I already addressed how we essentially work through the lower limb. Moving up through the hip and knee, it's going to be very basic low level plyometrics. So it's going to be some squat jumps where the athlete is, we've isolated it down to be able to work. So I might do a variation where I have the athlete torso more upright, chest upright, and performing a squat jump where they're getting a little bit more knee involved. I might then get a couple reps where the athlete is hinging forward, getting the hips more involved. We're going to start with hands on the hips, so they're not using their arms as levers. They have a little bit more control, and we're actually forcing the legs to work a little bit more by not using those upper body levers. We then progress that to some low-level alternating lunge jumps where we can perform the same thing, hands on the hips. We can perform torso upright and then hinging forward, again, working through the knee and then through the hip. So there's little nuance to all these little things where I want to essentially brick by brick lay that foundation. What's up, coaches? Real quickly, let me go ahead and introduce you to Performance Coach U certification. Now, this is the certification / course that I put together for coaches who want to train athletes and not only get results, but also maximize profits in the private sector. The problem that I saw with a lot of these courses and certifications out there for coaches was that they provided a lot of information and not a lot of application. So I wanted to pull back the covers over 10+ years of experience and show you the ins and outs of actually being in the trenches so that you get maximum results while also scaling your business. So if you're interested in this, go ahead and check out the link down below and you can get more information. From there, I like a lot of single leg jumps. So I might perform single leg broads, single leg box jumps, single leg lateral broads, single leg lateral box jumps. So working both in the horizontal and vertical planes, hands on the hips, we start with that. So they're not really throwing out with those levers, especially in the broad jump. And then from there, we start to progress it. So a lot of our speed and power training, and even our strength training for that matter, is extremely vanilla. But as I can't stress enough that the results of that phase come into the details and how it's administered by the coach. Moving on to strength and supplemental strength, our auxiliaries and our trunk. First phase, I'm a huge fan of just taking a very balanced approach. What that means is I want to be able to challenge the athlete. There's nothing specific to their sport at this time. We really want to essentially make sure that we're pushing and pulling in both the horizontal and vertical planes. We're hinging, we're squatting, we're lunging, and then we're also performing some kind of variation of lunge in the frontal plane. Rotating, and basically all the primal patterns that we're going to want to address with some resistance. Now, the big thing that we want to do here is we want to challenge them through the range of motion and instill good habits. So as an example, let's take a squat. First phase, I'm going to introduce like a 3-way squat. First movement is going to be in a sumo stance or wide, right? Where the athlete is essentially going to really challenge the range of motion of those adductors. Being able to turn on the glutes by being able to spread the floor, that creates those good habits in that wide base, and overall be able to really start to work that trunk with that front load, whether it be a goblet or with a barbell in the front rack position. Beyond that, they can perform a regular basic squat, where again, this is one where we really focus on instilling good habits. And what I mean by that is this is going to be your traditional squat where the feet are about shoulder width, toes are pointed forward. But the big goal here is on the eccentric and concentric phase, they're continuously trying to spread that floor, rip that floor apart. And what that allows us to do is really be able to produce torque through the hip and really instill good habits for them to really turn on that posterior chain when they are performing a squat, a bilateral squat pattern. And then finally, they're going to be feet together, where we're challenging a little bit more mobility, a little bit more range across that knee and ankle joint. And we're just going to allow that weight to sink them down eccentrically, be able to try to touch those glutes to those heels and essentially come back up, really, really stressing that range of motion and strength through that range of motion. So that's an example. I mean, this can work through all different variations. Let's say it's a lunge. You perform a forward and reverse. You perform a lateral, and then maybe a curtsy. We want to take the most balanced approach to making sure we're checking all those boxes at a a aggressive, I guess you could say, range of motion, or meet the athlete where they're at. And a lot of this prep phase actually becomes part of the assessment as well and screening process. Not to say we don't do it beforehand, but it just continues to further that, because I also want to see where their limitations are from a strength. I've had some athletes who display that flexibility during a screen, but then when you put a little load to it, you can see them start to crumble. And these are all important things that we need to know. Beyond that, a couple other things in the prep phase that I just want to be able to make sure that I add. Obviously this is when, once we've gotten the athlete going and moving, and we've got a couple training sessions under our belt, we then start to perform our baseline assessment and get our performance numbers or metrics that we're really trying to achieve by the end of the year. So we want to kind of check those in 3 different installments. Entrance of off season about midway, and this just lets me recalibrate the programming if I need to, and then final when we exit the off season and they enter their preseason or spring training or whatever it might be, camp. A big thing that I look for when recording any kind of data or metrics, you just got to understand that I like to compare end of off-season numbers. Any coach can take entrance numbers and elevate an athlete with a little bit of training. What I'm trying to do is compare end of off-season, and year after year, we want to continue to outdo. That means we're making true adaptation year over year and enhancing that athlete's abilities. Last thing I want to mention is I understand that, as a coach, this can be extremely tough to be able to have very vanilla, very basic meat and potatoes. What I have to say when it comes to that is the importance of laying the foundation from the muscle tissue all the way up to the nervous system. What you need to understand is if you start an athlete, first of all, what we need to understand is it really depends on the level of how trained they are or detrained they are. What you have to understand, and to give you context, a lot of my athletes either come in and they've trained the entire season, right? So that they're ready. And that allows me to only do a couple weeks of general prep training. Or I have athletes who have played 162 games and who are completely detrained, and I have to start them at that basic fundamental level, or else I will compromise them later. And if I don't, from some kind of, tissue response, then it comes from a nervous system, meaning you're going to pay later because they're going to burn out. So if I just come in and start hammering them with eccentrics on week 1, 2, 3, it's a little bit reckless, because one, they're going to pay later as far as you need to calculate loads over an entire off season, and the nervous system will usually start to diminish. You'll get diminishing returns later on. And 2, it just leaves you to a degree of being able to make them susceptible or more prone to injury if we're not checking and challenging those range of motion in the beginning of the off season. So it's just one of those things that, again, it depends on the level where the athlete comes in. Now, if there's an athlete that comes in and they've been training and maintaining all in season, then yeah, you can obviously load up a little bit more and you don't have to pull back the reins as much. But you just want to make sure that you can administer that and see that real time, as opposed to just what they've told you they've done, so that you can, again, just make sure that you're doing it in a proper fashion where you're not compromising them, but then you're also not burning them out, say phase 1, phase 2, or block 1, block 2 of your actual training. And that's when you start to see the stress really load up, and then the athlete actually doesn't start to or continuously have that trajectory of progress. So just wanted to make this because it was a discussion that we had within our coaching group. If you guys are interested in that, check out the link down below, OTA University, Performance Coach U. But I appreciate you listening, and I'll talk to you guys next time.